The rotor wash from the heavy transport chopper kicked up a blinding storm of dust and gravel that stung my face, but my heart was hammering against my ribs for an entirely different reason as I stared at the man who could end my military career with a single word. Hey everyone, before we dive into the dirt, sweat, and adrenaline of this confession, please drop a quick comment letting me know what city or country you are listening from. It really helps build our community. Thank you so much for the support. Now, let us get right back into the mud with this story. I was 23 when I got reassigned to the forward operating base of the 104th Air Assault Brigade, and let me be completely honest with you. I did not get this billet because I was some hardened, door-kicking war hero. I got it because they desperately needed a drone reconnaissance operator who could read topographic telemetry, and my file just happened to be on top of the pile at command headquarters. The deployment was brutal, stationed deep in a jagged, unforgiving mountain range where the wind always smelled like pine needles and aviation fuel. On my very first day, I dragged my heavy duffel bags across the muddy compound, wearing a stiff, unweathered uniform that practically screamed how green I was. I reported to the Tactical Operations Center, a massive, reinforced tent humming with the sound of servers and radio chatter. They told me to wait by the situation map, so I waited, shifting my weight from foot to foot, feeling entirely out of place among the heavily armed paratroopers moving past me. And then he walked in. Captain Marcus Thorne, the tactical commander of the assault unit I was now attached to. He was in his late 30s, though I did not know his exact age at the time. He was a tall, fiercely imposing man, wearing a tactical vest covered in dust, his helmet clipped to his belt, his dark hair plastered with sweat against his forehead. He had a sharp, square jaw and piercing eyes that seemed to instantly scan and evaluate every single threat and asset in the room. I was completely paralyzed. In that exact moment, staring at him, something shifted deep inside my chest. He walked straight up to me, extended a large, heavily calloused hand, and spoke with a voice that was low, gravelly, and commanded absolute authority. "Welcome to the unit, Corporal Vance. I expect you to keep my men alive up there. Do not fall behind." I shook his hand, feeling the rough texture of his skin against mine, and two very distinct thoughts crashed into my brain simultaneously. First, I was absolutely going to push myself to the breaking point to keep up with his expectations. Second, the faint scent of rain, gun oil, and something distinctly, cleanly masculine radiating from him was the most intoxicating thing I had ever experienced. The first month was an absolute hurricane of organized chaos. My job was essentially to be his eyes in the sky, maintaining the drone feeds, mapping out hostile terrain, predicting weather patterns that could ground our transport helicopters, and sitting in the corner of the command tent during high-level briefings, desperately trying to take coherent notes on my ruggedized tablet. I pretended to be deeply focused on the satellite imagery, but more often than not, my eyes were drawn to the way his uniform stretched across his broad shoulders when he leaned over the war table, or the intense, calculated way he traced patrol routes on the map. He was incredibly demanding, yes, but he was never one of those toxic, screaming officers who threw their weight around just to inflate their own egos. He led from the front. If you made a mistake, he did not yell. He just looked at you, a slow, heavy gaze with his right eyebrow slightly raised, and that quiet disappointment was 1,000 times worse than being screamed at. One single look like that, and I wanted to tear down my entire workstation and rebuild the drone from scratch, just to prove my worth to him. "Corporal Vance, there is a 15-minute blind spot in the drone coverage over the southern ridge during the third patrol phase," he said one afternoon, his eyes fixed on the primary monitor. "I will adjust the flight path and correct the battery swap schedule immediately, Captain," I replied, my voice slightly tighter than I wanted it to be. "And drop the rank when it is just us in the tent, Leo. It makes me feel like my father. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, for the first time, he looked away from the tactical screens and actually looked directly at me. Marcus, just Marcus, he said. I managed a shaky smile. He gave me a very faint, almost imperceptible smirk in return, a softening of his sharp features that made my chest tighten painfully, before he turned his attention back to the grim reality of the war map. As the grueling weeks dragged on, I found myself falling for him without permission, as it always happens when you are trapped in close quarters with someone magnificent. It was not a single cinematic moment of realization. It was a slow, agonizing accumulation of tiny, absurd details that a subordinate soldier should never memorize, but I hoarded them anyway. I noticed the way he rubbed the back of his neck when the brigade commander was pushing him too hard on the radio. I noticed that he always drank his field coffee black and bitter, but he would quietly pocket the small sugar packets from the ration boxes when he thought nobody was looking. I noticed that he was always the first one awake, checking the perimeter wire before dawn, and the last one to sleep, hunched over the reports long after the rest of the camp had gone quiet. Sometimes, when I brought him urgent weather updates, and he was deeply submerged in thought, it would take him a few seconds to register my presence. In those brief, stolen seconds, I could just stand there and observe the heavy exhaustion lining his face without him noticing me. The best, or perhaps the most excruciating part of this deployment was that occasionally the war would pause just long enough for him to speak to me about things other than grid coordinates and enemy movements. There were long, freezing nights when we were both stationed in the Overwatch bunker, staring out into the pitch-black tree line through night vision scopes. The silence between the howling mountain winds would stretch, and he would fill it with small fragments of himself. "You are not from a mountain town, are you?" he asked quietly one night, not taking his eyes off the optic. "No," I replied, shivering slightly despite my thermal gear. "I grew up on the coast. I joined the military because I wanted to see something bigger than the ocean, but I guess I just traded water for dirt." "I joined to pay for college," he murmured, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Paused. "That was 14 years ago. Still haven't enrolled." I did not know if he was expressing a regret or just stating a fact, but I locked that small piece of his history away in my mind as if it were a classified secret. The overwhelming problem, aside from the blindingly obvious fact that he was my commanding officer and could face a court-martial for fraternization, was that I knew absolutely nothing about his personal life outside of this muddy outpost. I did not know if he had a girlfriend or a wife waiting for him back at a civilian base. I did not know if he even liked men. I knew nothing. And when he was on duty, Marcus was an impenetrable fortress of professionalism. He never gave an inch more than was strictly required. He was always fair, always protective of his squad, but he maintained that exact, precise distance that a leader must keep when he is responsible for whether his men live or die. But there were glances, or, at least, in my most desperate, lonely moments, I wanted to believe there were glances. One evening, a terrible storm grounded all flights and the temperature plummeted. We had a critical logistics report due to command by morning. We were the only two left in the command tent. We were eating cold, packaged rations because the mess hall had flooded. We sat across from each other at the main plotting table, maps and tactical overlays scattered everywhere. At some point, the hum of the generators outside became background noise, and we stopped talking about the supply chain. "Why did you really request this specific combat attachment?" he asked suddenly, leaning back in his creaking folding chair. "With your technical scores, you could be sitting in a climate-controlled bunker in the capital, flying drones from a comfortable leather chair." "I needed the hazard pay," I answered honestly, looking down at my hands. "And I wanted to prove I could handle the real thing, not just a simulation." "Is that it? Just the money and the ego?" He tilted his head. He was looking at me with an expression that was heavy, searching, trying to peel back my layers. I held his gaze. I lied, Of course I lied. I could not tell him that I had almost quit during my first week, terrified of the artillery noise and the crushing responsibility. I could not tell him that the only reason I stayed, the only reason I pushed through the exhaustion and the fear, was because by day 3 I had already fallen completely, foolishly in love with him, and the mere thought of transferring out and never seeing his face again felt like a physical wound. He nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on my face for a fraction of a second too long, as if he knew I was holding something back. But he let it go and returned to the logistics report. The breaking point arrived on a freezing Tuesday, as crises usually do, without any warning and at the absolute worst possible moment. We were coordinating a massive, multi-squad search and rescue drill in the surrounding mountains, preparing for a real-world extraction. I had plotted the coordinates, calibrated the drone's thermal imaging, mapped out the safest extraction routes. Everything was perfect, or so I believed. Until 14 hours into the exercise, at 3 in the morning, Marcus called me over to the main console. His voice lacked its usual steady calm. It had an edge of suppressed panic. "Leo, the thermal signatures on grid sector Delta Niner do not match the terrain elevation. If the assault team fast ropes down there, they are dropping into a ravine, not a clearing." All the blood instantly drained from my face. My stomach violently dropped into my boots. "Let me check the calibration," I stammered, my hands shaking as I reached for the keyboard. "I already checked it," he said, stepping aside so I could see the raw data. "Look." He was right. It was my error. A catastrophic miscalculation in the atmospheric density parameters had skewed the laser rangefinder by 100 meters. In a simulation, it was a failed grade. In a real extraction, which this was preparing us for, it would have meant broken legs or worse for his men. "I will recalibrate and transmit the corrected grid immediately," I said, my voice barely a whisper, fighting the overwhelming urge to throw up. "I know you will," he said, his voice hard. "What I need to know is if there are any other blind spots in this telemetry that I am sending my men into." For the next 3 agonizing hours, we tore apart every single line of code, every terrain map, every flight path. He stood directly behind my chair, so incredibly close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body in the freezing tent. I could hear the rhythmic, deep sound of his breathing. When he leaned over my shoulder to point at a discrepancy on the glowing monitor, the heavy fabric of his tactical vest brushed against my shoulder, and the rough fabric of his sleeve dragged across my forearm. I had to clench my jaw and grip the edge of the metal desk with white knuckles to stop myself from completely turning into him, from seeking comfort in his strength. When we finally finished, it was past dawn. The simulation was salvaged. Command accepted the new data. I slumped back in my chair, my eyes burning, completely hollowed out by the adrenaline crash and the shame of my failure. "Good work," he said quietly from behind me. "Thank you. I am so sorry for the error, Captain." "It will not happen again," I muttered, staring at the blank screen. "It is handled," he said, pausing for a long moment. "Hey, Leo, what is going on? Are you all right?" I slowly turned the chair around to face him. He was leaning against the edge of the briefing table, his arms crossed over his chest, looking down at me. But his expression had completely changed. The stern, demanding commander was gone. He just looked like a deeply exhausted man, staring at me with a raw, unprotected intensity. "Yes, I am fine. Why?" "You have been walking around for the last month looking like you are carrying a 100-pound rucksack on your chest." He uncrossed his arms and let them drop to his sides. "It is not my business, but it is affecting you. I am noticing it." I desperately wanted to say something professional. I wanted to blame the altitude, the lack of sleep, the bad rations. I wanted to give him a sterile, military excuse. But the exhaustion had stripped away all my filters. Instead, what actually fell out of my mouth was, "It is because it is too damn hard being around you all the time." The silence that followed was absolute. The generators outside seemed to fade away. "Hard how?" he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper, carefully measured, stepping onto a minefield. And there it was, the explosive question I'd been asking myself every single night as I stared at the canvas roof of my tent. Hard how? I could have said it was hard because he expected perfection. I could have said it was hard because the work environment was relentless. Instead, I looked directly into his dark, tired eyes, my heart pounding so violently I thought my ribs would crack. Hard because of the way you look at me when you think I am not paying attention. Hard because you smell like rain and cedar, and you stand so close to me that I can't breathe. Hard because I am completely in love with you, and it is driving me insane, I said. The world did not end. The tent did not collapse, but absolutely nothing happened for about 10 seconds that felt like 10 lifetimes. Marcus did not say a word. He just stared at me, completely motionless. A wave of terrifying, suffocating panic washed over me. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to literally evaporate into the mountain mist, resign my commission, flee the country. "Sir, I am sorry," I started, my voice cracking, stumbling over my words as I tried to stand up. "I know that is completely out of line. I know you are my commanding officer, and this is a court-martial offense. You do not have to say anything. I will request a transfer to another forward operating base first thing tomorrow morning. I swear, Leo, stop." His voice was not an order, it was a plea. Firm, but entirely devoid of anger. I stopped moving. He pushed off the table. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward me. He leaned down, placing a heavy hand on each of the armrests of my chair, effectively trapping me there without actually touching my body. His face was now perfectly level with mine. "How long have you been carrying that around?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating rumble in the quiet tent. "Since the second week of the deployment," I admitted, my breath hitching, unable to look away from his mouth. He let out a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was a heavy, breathless exhale, the sound of a man who had just survived a mortar strike and realized he was still in one piece. "I have been carrying it since the day you walked into this tent," he confessed. For a terrifying second, my brain refused to process the words. "What?" "You heard me." I stared at him, desperately waiting for the punchline, for the cruel joke, for him to tell me he was testing my psychological resilience. But Marcus remained right there, holding my gaze with a terrifying vulnerability, and that was the most overwhelming thing of all, because it meant he was telling the absolute truth. The air in the tent suddenly felt impossibly thick, charged with a heavy magnetic static. "Do not look at me like that," I whispered, my voice trembling. A small crease appeared between his brows. "Like what?" "Like this is real," I breathed out. "Like we just crossed a wire, and there is no way back for either of us." His eyes flickered down to my lips for a fraction of a second, before locking onto my eyes again. It was so fast I might have imagined it, but the sudden, sharp intake of his breath told me I hadn't. I became agonizingly aware of his proximity. I could see the fine, silver scars near his temple, the exhaustion under his eyes, the way his knuckles were white from gripping the plastic armrests. Neither of us moved. Neither of us dared to shatter the fragile reality we had just created. For the first time since I met him, Captain Marcus Thorne looked just as terrified as I felt. "Why didn't you say anything?" I finally asked, a defensive anger masking my overwhelming relief. "Because I am your commanding officer, Leo. Because I hold your career and your life in my hands. And I never, ever wanted you to feel pressured to reciprocate just because of the rank on my chest." It felt like an abuse of power. We stayed frozen like that for another long, heavy moment. Then, slowly, he straightened up. He dragged a hand through his dark, messy hair, a gesture I had memorized over countless stressful nights, and took a step back, putting a safe distance between us. Go back to your barracks, Corporal. Get some sleep. The debriefing is at 1400 hours. He turned his back to me, facing the situational map. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. Is that it? I asked, unable to hide the desperation in my tone. For today, yes, he replied, his voice rough. But as I reached the flap of the tent, he turned his head slightly, looking at me over his shoulder. Thank you for being braver than I was, Leo. I walked out into the freezing mountain dawn with my heart in absolute ruins, but my chest felt incredibly, inexplicably light. 2 weeks later, our deployment ended. We packed up the FOB and were transported back to the main civilian-attached military base in the city. The transition back to civilization was jarring. We were still technically in the same unit, but the crushing, life-or-death pressure of the mountains was gone. We spent a week doing paperwork and equipment maintenance. On a Friday evening, after the final debriefing was filed, I was walking down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of the administration building. Marcus fell into step beside me. He was wearing his standard garrison uniform, looking sharp, distant, and completely professional. Have you made any plans for your weekend leave? He asked, looking straight ahead at the exit doors. No, sir, just catching up on sleep, I replied, my heart doing a familiar stutter. Good. Neither have I, he said, pushing open the heavy glass doors. The warm evening air hit us. He finally looked at me, away from the security cameras. Let's go get dinner in town. And Leo, leave the uniform in your locker. It was not an order from a captain. It was a request from Marcus. I practically tore through my civilian clothes in my barracks, rejecting shirt after shirt, feeling like a nervous teenager instead of a combat-trained soldier. When I finally walked out to the parking lot, he was leaning against his dark truck. He was wearing dark jeans and a fitted black Henley shirt. Seeing him out of uniform, stripped of his rank and tactical gear, was devastating to my self-control. He looked rugged, relaxed, and impossibly handsome. You look good, he said, his eyes slowly dragging over me as I approached. I smiled, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. You don't look so bad yourself. The dinner at a quiet, dimly lit steakhouse on the edge of town was incredibly easy. All the tension of the command tent evaporated. We talked about our families, our regrets, the movies we loved, the places we wanted to travel when we finally discharged. For the first time, there was no chain of command. We were just two men, exhausted by the military, finding comfort in each other. When the bill was paid, neither of us made a move toward the exit. Do you want to come back to my place for a drink? He asked, his voice low, his eyes locked onto mine. I did not hesitate. I nodded. His apartment was close to the base, neat, minimalist, and quiet. He locked the door behind us, the deadbolt echoing loudly in the silent room. He walked over to the small kitchen counter, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and turned to hand me one. As I reached for the glass, he did not let go. He stepped forward, closing the final few inches between us. The space disappeared. I could feel the heat of his body, smell the lingering scent of his cologne and the whiskey. He reached up, his large, warm hand cupping the side of my neck, his thumb gently brushing across my jawline. He smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached his eyes. Hello, he whispered. I let out a breathy, nervous laugh, my eyes fluttering shut for a second at his touch. Hello. Can we finally drop the discipline now? I asked, my voice trembling. He took the glass from my hand, set it on the counter alongside his own, and wrapped both of his arms around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest. Yes, we can, he murmured, right against my lips. The kiss obliterated the last remaining wall between us. It was a collision of months of suppressed tension, fear, and desperate longing. The rigid military commander vanished, and all that was left was a man who wanted me just as fiercely as I wanted him. His calloused hands were firm but incredibly gentle, as he guided me backwards until my legs hit the edge of the heavy leather sofa in his living room. Everything that had stood in our way, the ranks, the danger, the protocol, simply burned away in the heat of his embrace. I remember the exact moment we pulled back just slightly to catch our breath. I opened my eyes and looked at him, truly looked at him, without fear of being caught. He was staring down at me with a mixture of total awe and a heavy, consuming desire that erased every single doubt I had ever harbored. I felt a brief, terrifying spike of panic, the fear of not being enough for someone so commanding, so experienced. But as he pulled me down onto the sofa with him, the weight of his body pressing me into the cushions, that fear completely dissolved. I let him take the lead, let him guide the rhythm of the night. It was a storm of raw, physical connection, a heavy, desperate tangle of limbs and breathless whispers in the dark. He made me feel entirely safe and entirely consumed all at once. By the time the early morning light began to filter through his blinds, we were completely exhausted, tangled in the blankets we had dragged off the bed, my head resting heavily on his bare chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. The next Monday, the reality of the base returned, but the world had shifted on its axis. Every time I walked past his office, every time I handed him a decrypted file, my skin hummed with the memory of his hands in the dark. It has been 4 years since that freezing night in the command tent. We navigated the impossible maze of military regulations, eventually securing transfers that allowed us to be together without hiding. The crushing anxiety of that first deployment forged a foundation that nothing could break. Today, we are both out of the service, living in a house by the coast, just like I always wanted. And the terrifying, untouchable Captain Thorne turned out to be the most deeply devoted, loving partner I could have ever asked for in this life. All right, guys, that is the end of today's story. Now it is your turn. I want to hear from you. Do you think Leo took too big of a risk confessing to his commanding officer while deployed? Or was it the only way to break the tension? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you have a story you want to share, send it to the link in the description. And please do not forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a confession. See you in the next one.